But you said something that was interesting, and it was right before we actually started the show, Anne-Marie. You said that we are on the precipice of a very historic week. And that is, of course, because we're looking at the second impeachment trial of former President Donald Trump, which is set to begin tomorrow on Capitol Hill. The showdown will feature Democrats presenting their case and highlighting evidence they say proves Mr. Trump incited an insurrection on January 6th. They're expected to rely heavily on video from the assault and even the former president's own words, urging his supporters to stop the steal and march to the Capitol. However, former President Trump's lawyers will argue he was exercising his First Amendment right to free speech. Meanwhile, in his first TV network interview, President Biden spoke with CBS Evening News anchor and managing editor Norah O'Donnell about his pandemic response and the COVID relief bill. Nancy Cordes is following the latest in Wilmington, Delaware.
President Biden watched the Super Bowl with family here in Wilmington after sitting down for that wide-ranging interview with CBS Evening News anchor and managing editor Norah O'Donnell. They talked about the toll that this pandemic has taken on school children, and he said that government guidance is finally coming for how schools can safely reopen.
You have to have fewer people in the classroom. You have to have ventilation systems that have been reworked.
President Biden told Norah O'Donnell that federal guidance for a return to school is coming this week.
Our CDC commissioner we just named is going to be coming out with science-based judgment within, I think, as early as next Wednesday as to lay out what the minimum requirements are.
The president also laid out some of his red lines in the next COVID relief bill.
You've said you're not compromising on the $1,400 checks.
No.
He said he is willing to deal on some things, like lowering the income cutoff for stimulus checks and holding off on a $15 minimum wage. But on other provisions, like $400 a week unemployment benefits for the next 6 months, Mr. Biden is holding firm, to the frustration of a group of Senate Republicans who had hoped he would meet them halfway.
The administration is showing very clearly they don't care if they have to work with us.
The COVID bill could be overshadowed this week by the second Senate impeachment trial of former President Trump, accused of inciting an insurrection last month.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Over the weekend, Wyoming Republican Liz Cheney was censured by her state party, but the Congresswoman said she did not regret voting to impeach.
What we already know is enough for his impeachment. This is not something that we can simply look past or pretend didn't happen or try to move on.
A conviction in the Senate is unlikely.
This impeachment, in the eyes of most Republicans, is an unconstitutional exercise.
Mr. Biden told CBS News that his predecessor should no longer get classified intelligence briefings.
Why not?
Because of his erratic behavior unrelated to the insurrection.
After that interview, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki clarified that President Biden trusts his intelligence officials to make a final determination about whether President Trump should receive future briefings. Also, over the weekend, President Biden was among those paying tribute to George Shultz, who was President Reagan's Secretary of State. President Biden called him a gentleman of honor and ideas. He died on Saturday at the age of 100 years old. Lad, Anne-Marie.
All right, Nancy, thank you very much. So for more on this, let us bring in CBS News Capitol Hill producer Rebecca Kaplan. She is with us now from Washington. You were joining us on the phone, Rebecca. So thank you very much. Okay, impeachment part 2, or number 2 anyways, is set to begin tomorrow. As we mentioned, this will be a little bit different than the first impeachment. You know, we all watched a string of witnesses throughout the first impeachment process, but those witnesses were testifying in front of the Intelligence Committee. It was part of the impeachment inquiry. Now when we talk about witnesses, we're talking about whether or not there will be witnesses at a Senate trial. Do we know what to expect in terms of that? Will witnesses be testifying?
Well, good morning, Anne-Marie. At this point, it does not look like we're going to have witnesses testifying, but frankly, it's still an open question that hasn't been decided. One of the big things that we saw was this back and forth last week between the impeachment managers who requested that President Trump come testify, and then his lawyers who responded essentially telling the Democratic impeachment managers to go pound sand, that he thought the request was just a political ploy and a joke, and it wasn't something that they were even going to take seriously. So that really settled the question of whether we were going to see President Trump show up to actually come testify in his own impeachment trial. He did not last time either. And so far, we have not seen any indication from those impeachment managers that they plan to try to subpoena the former president to make him appear. So while they could potentially call other people, there's still a question of, who could they bring in to talk about this that actually wouldn't necessarily invoke executive privilege, which was something we saw a lot during the first impeachment trial. Any associates of the president that Democrats wanted to bring in would say that they were protected by this concept of the executive privilege, where their conversations with the president can remain private, and so there wouldn't be much for them to say, and that would be a big obstacle. And the other factor at play here is that sources tell me Democrats are planning on making extensive use of video from the attack itself, both President Trump speaking at that rally beforehand and those protesters who streamed themselves live breaking into the Capitol. And that's going to be the bulk of their argument. And witnesses are not nearly as critical in this case because the American people really saw that attack play out live on national television, not to mention the senators who are going to be sitting as jurors, and we'll see them sworn in tomorrow, were all present in the chamber in the Capitol during that attack.
So, Rebecca, what can we expect then from former President Trump's legal team, especially if, as you say, the Democrats plan to use video and his own words to prove that he incited an insurrection?
Well, they sort of have a two-pronged argument here. Their first line of attack is to argue that the trial itself is unconstitutional. They say that the Constitution specifies that only a sitting president can be tried for impeachment, and once someone is no longer a sitting president, that the Senate no longer has the power to try them. Now, Democrats have argued back that that's not the case. There's sort of two lines of thinking here. One, that there's these separate questions in the Constitution, one of removing a president from office, and two, of barring that person from holding future office, which is, part of what the incentive is here for Democrats, to bar the former president from holding future office. And then there's also precedent. You have seen in the past the Senate try people who resigned from their positions. There's this famous Secretary of War from a couple centuries ago, William Belknap, who resigned just before the House was going to impeach him. And the Senate actually passed a motion that said we can still impeach him because, resigning should not be a way to avoid punishment. That doesn't make sense. The other argument we'll hear from the president's lawyers is that he didn't engage in insurrection. A couple things here. They argue he has this First Amendment right to talk about everything he said that day. They'll say his words did not actually engage in insurrection or tell people to go attack the Capitol. And they're saying that there's actually no evidence that can prove everything he said about the election and the claims he was making about election fraud and ballots being stolen and everything. They're saying there's no evidence to prove that's not true. So they're actually carrying on this argument the president was making, saying that there was a fraudulent election. And they're saying that that gave him a First Amendment right to talk about that in the lead up to January 6th itself, which is what got his supporters so angry.
So switching gears rather a little bit, Rebecca, I want to ask you about President Biden's COVID relief bill. We're learning that Democrats are expected to unveil a new part of the legislation that is specifically aimed at tackling child poverty during this pandemic. Any details for us?
Sure. We can tell you that there's a few $1,000s in child tax credits that the House Democrats are going to write into this bill. That would be about $3,600 per child for children under 6 and $3,000 per child for children up to 17. Now, that would actually phase out for higher income earners, so they're not talking about giving this kind of tax break to everyone, but certainly people who have been hardest hit by the economy. And that's an effort, now the Democrats are doing this big stimulus legislation and doing everything they can to help bring people out of this pandemic. It's an extra effort to kind of go in and make sure that there's more money in the pockets of Americans. And of course, tax credits and tax cuts are an idea that's traditionally more popular with the Republican Party. So perhaps even a way to get some Republicans on board, even though so far this seems like it is going to be largely a party line Democratic effort.
And Rebecca, a group of bipartisan lawmakers are now pushing Congress to pass a massive vaccine funding proposal. What more can you tell us about that?
So last Friday, we saw the House Problem Solvers Caucus, which is this bipartisan group of House Republicans and Democrats, some of whom have appeared on your guys' show before, come forward with this plan to do an immediate $160 billion plan that focuses pretty tightly on testing and vaccination, kind of surging these immediate resources that are needed to help stop the pandemic right now. Their argument was we should not give up on the larger negotiations, but those are going to take a while. You know, we are looking at potentially a mid-March passage date for this larger stimulus bill or COVID relief bill that the president and Congress are working on, and that's only if everything goes right and all of the negotiations go well. So they're saying it could still take a while, and these needs are immediate. We need to surge resources to vaccines and to testing. So let's go ahead and pass this immediately. There's broad agreement among Republicans and Democrats that this is where money is needed. So let's not, hold this up. Let's get it done now. Here's the problem is if you take away the easiest parts of this big package that everyone agrees on, and this is the case of all legislation, not just COVID relief, once you take out the parts that are easy to agree on, there's very little incentive for people to come to the table and negotiate on the things that are more difficult to get agreement on. So that's why, the president, the White House has said pretty clearly they are not interested in breaking this up into two packages. And from what we saw from Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, they are also committed to getting this done in one big package. So it's unlikely to happen, but will put a little bit of pressure on the administration, especially as they are pushing forward with this one massive $1.9 trillion package.
All right, to be continued. Rebecca Kaplan, as always, we thank you.
Great to be with you guys.